Hey guys, welcome to week number 2, day number 1 here of week 2. A lot to get to. We're getting knock out 3 chapters in Genesis as we go through Genesis 16, 17, and 18, and then we go into Mark chapter 6. A lot to get to. We're starting to get into some good stuff here with Abraham, or as Abram turns into Abraham, and so a lot of stuff going on here in first in verse in chapter 16. We get the fight, for lack of a better term, between Sarai and Hagar, her Egyptian servant. And so Sarai, she's we know that she's about 76 years old at this point. Abraham is 86 at this point, and still no kids, even though God has promised Abraham all these descendants. And so Sarai gets impatient with how this is going, and so she gives Hagar, her servant, to Abraham as a wife. And so Abraham takes Hagar as his wife. Hagar, of course, is not on the same level as Sarai. We're going to go with Sarah from now on. We do see this a number of times throughout the Old Testament. Maybe David and Solomon are the two best examples of these multiple wives situations, the polygamist situations, and all of them have their issues. And the Bible is very clear on how they feel about on how its polygamy is handled, specifically in Deuteronomy, and we'll deal with that when we get into Deuteronomy. And of course, and this obviously has major problems: the marriage of Abraham and Hagar, and the marriage of Abraham and Sarah. So Sarah isn't real thrilled. Hagar, of course, gets pregnant right away, and she looks down on Sarah as because Sarah can't have kids. And so there's these issues, that obviously arise, and the petty jealousies, and we see a lot of humanity in this story. And so Sarah is dealing harshly with Hagar, and so Hagar, as she, like a lot of us would have done in her position, she takes off, and God goes and talks to her and promises her this son that she will name Ishmael. And Ishmael, we do see him mentioned a few more times here in the next few chapters. But really, as far as the story of the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, and then into Christianity, Ishmael doesn't play a very big factor in that. Ishmael does play a big factor in the religion of Islam. The Muslims hold that Ishmael is the descendant that their religion comes from. And so that's why we say that the 3 big Abrahamic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam traces their lineage back to Ishmael, and there's actually some fairly significant evidence to support that. And we're gonna come back to this here in a little bit. As we see in Genesis, we start these stories, and then we go to a different story, and then we come back to finish the original story. And we're going to do that when we come back into chapter 17. And 17 starts off with Abraham and the covenant of circumcision, and this turns into, as we will see when we get to Acts, and we're going to talk much more, we'll dive much deeper into the circumcision debate, if you will, arguments, however you want to handle it. But this was the circumcision, of course, we know it is the cutting off of the foreskin of the penis. And so this is, first of all, this is not just a Hebrew specific. This was not just a Jewish thing. In fact, there's evidence that this was practiced in ancient Egypt, specifically the temple workers in ancient Egypt. So this is, maybe not as, a fully common worldwide thing, but this is not the only time, only place, and only culture that this happens. but I think the one big takeaway that I take away from the idea of circumcision is that it's a very personal thing, uh, and it's a this is not a sign of the covenant between Abraham and or Abraham's descendants and God. The sign is not visible to anybody. They're not. None of us are walking around with the family jewels, for lack of a better term, floating out there. So you're not. It's not being seen outside of the marriage, and so it's between God and that individual man. So. And really that comes down to it's a heart thing. Are we circumcised in our hearts, to really focus and be one with God? And really that of course runs the basis of this arguments and the debates that the apostles have in Acts, specifically Acts 15, when we get to the Jerusalem Council. And so, but this all starts here. The idea of circumcision all comes down here into chapter 17. And then we get into the promise of Isaac. Isaac is going to be the first son of Abraham and Sarah. And we get this great dialogue of, the angel of the Lord. And when we read the angel of the Lord, when we read that, and we come across it at various times in the Old Testament, you can read that as a pre-incarnation Jesus. You can think of it as Jesus before he, came down through the virgin birth through Mary and had his ministry. This is Jesus in pre-incarnate form, because he speaks with the authority of God, and we see that in this conversation that he has with Abraham. That he is speaking with the authority of God. The angels can't do that. Michael and Gabriel, they can pass on things, but God is the only one that can speak for God, right? And say the words of God. So when we see that at various times throughout the Old Testament, when we see the angel of the Lord and we look into what he is saying, we can kind of decipher if that is a pre-incarnate Jesus or if it's just an angel relaying the message that God has done. So we see this that they're promising Isaac is going to be the thing, and I come down to chapter 17. This story obviously spills over between chapter 17 and 18, but maybe the really important part of this story, especially as it relates to us as Christians, is verses in chapter 17, verses 20 and 21, and it reads in my Bible, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly." We just talked about that. "He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." Is Ishmael because God promised that Abraham was going to have these great descendants and this great number of descendants. Ishmael, and again, like we talked about how the Muslims kind of trace their lineage back to Ishmael. So that adds up. But then it's verse 21 where it really kind of hits home for us. "But," and this is God talking, "but I will establish my covenant with Isaac, with whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." So as we continue to read through the entirety of the Bible here, this is all in line with Isaac, and it all starts with Isaac. It starts with Abraham. It goes back to Noah, and of course we go back, to Adam. So all of this all goes through the line of Isaac, and of course that's where we get the major, split, if you will, between the Muslims and the Christians, is tracing our lineage and our, historical perspectives back to the sons of Abraham. And then, of course, at the end of chapter 18, after you could say that after the angel of the Lord and Abraham are having the conversation, and he, gives his update on Isaac, the promise of Isaac, they have a conversation where the angel of the Lord is going to go and destroy Sodom. And we know, obviously, Sodom and Gomorrah is, a very well-known story, and so we know that it's a very evil place, and we see that Abraham is trying to bargain his way to save Sodom, and he starts like, if there's 50 righteous people, will you save the city? And Jesus says, yes, I will. Well, he knows that he can't find 50, so he bargains it down to 10 if he can find 10 righteous people in all of the city of Sodom, Jesus will save that city. Obviously, we know that that is not possible as we get, farther in, and as we go back and we look, into tomorrow's reading when we see what happens in Sodom. So we flip back over to Mark chapter 6. A lot of great stuff in Mark chapter 6. It starts off with a great story of Jesus being rejected at Nazareth, his hometown. And you got to remember that Jesus, when we talk about the man Jesus, and we have that 18-year gap roughly that we don't know, we have nothing recorded in the Bible as far as what Jesus was doing. We can kind of understand through different archaeological and different studies. We can kind of paint a fairly broad picture that Jesus would have, he would have followed Joseph into being a carpenter, and he probably would have been working on some of the cities in and around Nazareth, and so when he goes back and he's been doing all this great preaching, and he's been healing people, and he's been casting out demons, and he's been doing all these great works, and then he gets to Nazareth, and everybody in Nazareth is like, who are you? Aren't you Joseph and Mary's son? Aren't you the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Don't you have sisters that live here? So they basically reject him, and he has that famous words, that he could not, do there, because of, you're not, prophesying in your hometown. So then we get a fairly detailed look at the death of John the Baptist and the evil of King Herod. And Herod, even though he knows that John is a prophet, and he understands the importance of John, he follows through with his words, and this is just an example of the evil of the Roman Empire and the kingdom of Herod, and that they executed John the Baptist. And then we have the great famous story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and we look at that and we understand that they count it and they list it as 5,000 men. So you can kind of figure that's not counting women and children. There's probably 10 to 15,000, people, at this sermon, and they're out in this big plain, and Jesus feeds them, with the fish and the loaves, and what I always, as I read this, and I think of you think of like a football stadium or a baseball stadium that has 10,000 people in it, right? And if you don't have, obviously they did not have these fancy speakers that we have now and microphones and all of this, and it's really the Word of God, is projecting Jesus's voice, right? He's saying it, and so you got to figure, there's only the people right in the front row, front few rows or whatever can hear him specifically, but everybody there, otherwise there would have been a mass exodus. We wouldn't have these large gatherings, but the Holy Spirit is spreading Jesus's voice out and throughout this great crowd. And then another one of the great, famous stories of Jesus walking on the water. And this is one of those stories that I find a lot of comfort in. The apostles or the disciples at this point, they are out on, they're out on the water, and these guys have been around Jesus every day. They've listened to him preach. They've seen all the signs. They've seen the miracles. They've seen him casting out demons. They see it on a daily basis. And still they struggled with faith. And Jesus says it, that, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got into the boat with him and the wind ceased. And, they were struggling. They were scared and they didn't have faith. And so that is kind of a comfort to me that these guys that were around Jesus every day, they saw it with their own eyes, they still struggled with it at times. And so, us now, we all have those days where we don't understand what God's doing in our lives. We don't see the end game and we kind of lose faith. It's just really important to come back and allow God to do what he's doing in your hearts and in your lives. So that's all we have for day 1 of week number 2. Day 2, we're reading Genesis chapters 19 and 20. We're going to read Psalms number 1 and then Mark chapter 7. So stay tuned for that. Check out those readings, and we'll see you tomorrow.